Thank you for joining today's LIHEAP webinar on vendor agreements and why are they important.
Good afternoon or morning for those on the West Coast and in Alaska. My name is Patrick Strickland, and I work as a LIHEAP travel training and technical assistance contractor for Travel Tech. This is the second LIHEAP travel webinar in a series of 2 for the current fiscal year. It is Travel Tech's job to furnish training and technical assistance to LIHEAP travel grantees. We do this through developing materials for conferences, webinars, travel for on-site technical assistance visits, and travel roundtables. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Vicki Pretlow, who is the Program Analyst and Travel Liaison with the Office of Community Service, Division of Energy Assistance. Vicki?
Thank you, Patrick. Welcome, everyone, to our webinar on vendor agreements. We're really pleased that you all are able to join us today. Before we get started, I'd just like to ask that everyone mute your phone line, and that if you have any questions during the course of the presentation, you can type those in the chat box. We'll have an opportunity for questions at the end, and we'll read those at that time. So today's webinar will place emphasis on understanding vendor agreements for tribal grantees. You more than likely have participated in training focused on how to develop vendor agreements without a more full understanding of why they are important. So that will be our focus today, and also why customizing vendor agreements for your program is important. Our objectives today will include learning why it is important to establish relationships and maintain communication with vendors, understanding that there's no one agreement that will work for every grantee, so there's no one-size-fits-all approach. You will also receive an overview of LIHEAP Assurance 7 and hear federal agency expectations. You'll hear from grantees on their process of negotiating with vendors and establishing relationships. And then lastly, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions for our presenters to answer. With that, I'll hand it over to Ms. Iris Curtis. Iris is an auditor with the Office of Community Services Division of Energy Assistance. Iris?
Thank you, Vicki. Hello, everyone. So we're just going to talk a little bit about who are your energy vendors. And we know that probably your larger vendors are going to be your electric and your natural gas, maybe even propane suppliers, where it's probably a little bit easier to get agreements with them. But then some of your smaller vendors, such as your coal supplier or your wood supplier, may be a little bit more difficult getting agreements with them, if they just don't have a lot of clients. But we want to make sure that you understand that it's so important to have vendor agreements in place, just so that they know what you expect and you know what to expect from them, and everything is in writing. So in your vendor agreements, we want you to be very specific in identifying the terms and conditions of what is expected of them. Writing out the details, what are the costs, the date of the contract, what is the period of the contract going to be for, making sure that you're keeping in mind what your needs are, how to get that information from the vendor, and what's going to work best in protecting your clients. And as we've stated, and we're going to continue to state, written agreements is the way to go. When you have a verbal agreement, there's so much room for, well, I didn't understand that, I thought you meant this, and when did that happen? So if you have it in writing, it's just so clear to know these are the expectations of what's going to happen in this agreement. Some of the things that I want to give some examples of things you can have in your vendor agreements is payment expectations. When you make a pledge to the vendor on behalf of your clients, if they're going to give you, say, 3 or 4 days or 24 hours, whatever that time frame is of when you'll actually make the payment, and the client service will not be interrupted, that's the kind of information you can have in that vendor agreement. If you're looking to your vendors to give you refunds, if a client wasn't able to use the entire benefit that they received for the year, maybe because they moved out of the area or someone passed away, and that benefit is still sitting there, if you give them a specific date, we'll just say August, all vendor refunds should be sent back to you by a specific date so that you can then re-obligate those funds and still use them in the same year. So all of these kinds of negotiations, this is what you want to have in your vendor agreement, and really take the time to think about what you want, what you hope to see, and when you sit down and negotiate with them, put it in the agreement so that there's no misunderstanding. The next area is talking about just the specifics of the agreement, what to include in them, what are the consequences if they're not following those rules. And having, we'll talk a little bit about the time frame, but in having these agreements, when you're sitting down with them and you're explaining to them this is what we expect, they need to know that there are consequences if they're not doing what you're asking. I'm not sure if you have other vendors in the area that you can use, but these are the kinds of things you want to look at in making sure that they're giving you what you need to best suit your client. And so Assurance 10, which is my favorite of the assurances, it really talks about how you're handling the money and how things are being traced. Assurance 10 talks about you're going to have those receipts. You're going to have the proper documentation. So when you do the eligibility process and you determine which clients receive a certain amount of funds and payments are going to which vendors, making sure that you're keeping track of that. You have copies of that. So when we come out and we're asking you, how did you spend your LIHEAP funds, you want to make sure that you have, if you have a major vendor list of all the vendors and then all of the clients that were paid, you made payments to the vendors on behalf of those clients, that you have that kind of documentation and keeping that so that you're able to trace where your payments are going. And the next one is Assurance 7, and that one deals more specifically with the relationship of the grantees and the vendors. And under Assurance 7, it talks about, or it relates to making sure that your vendors are not treating the LIHEAP grantee clients any differently than they're treating anyone else. And so if you make a payment to vendors on behalf of clients, clients should be informed of what that amount is so that they can make sure the vendor is not charging them the full amount of their bill. For instance, if their bill is $300, you make a payment on behalf of that client to the vendor for $100, then the vendor should only be charging them $200, not the full $300. So these are the kinds of things that Assurance 7 talks about, and making sure that communication is there both with the client and also with the vendor. And this is talking about making making payments directly to the vendors, and then establishing that, that information, that open communication again about what's being paid on their behalf, what the vendor is receiving, so that they know what their portion will be as opposed to what the LIHEAP payment is going to be giving them. So it just breaks down a little bit more what I talked about for Assurance 7. Okay. And then for the duration of your vendor agreement, we really want you to think about whether your vendor agreement is going to be or is currently for 1 year, or if it's for several years. And our recommendation is that your agreements are annually. That way, as the needs are changing, as the client needs are changing, the different weather conditions. You're making sure that you're getting the best information and the most relevant and up-to-date information in those agreements of how to work with your vendor agreement to run an effective program. So we don't mandate that you have annual agreements, but we certainly strongly encourage that you do that so that you can make those necessary changes as things are being revealed to you and then in working with your vendors and your clients. And with that in mind, I'm going to hand it over.
Okay, thank you, Iris.
To Brenda.
Next, we'll hear from Ms. Brenda Ilg. Brenda serves as the Energy Assistance Program Manager with the State of Wyoming's Department of Family Services. Brenda?
Thank you, Vicki, and hello, everyone. Wyoming has had some form of a vendor agreement in place for many years. And again, I would reiterate, I'm going to talk about some of the specifics that we have in place in Wyoming. But again, there's no one right way, there's no one right vendor agreement. This is just one of many examples. We revised and updated our vendor agreement to include the sharing of fuel cost. Like I said, we revised and updated our vendor agreement to include the sharing of fuel cost and consumption data when we were preparing for the performance measure reporting just a few years back. And the reason that we did that is we felt we were going to be having some new expectations for our fuel vendors. So we wanted to be sure to get that included in the vendor agreement that we had in place. So we scheduled our very first vendor summit, and we invited our fuel vendors to be part of the solution for gathering that new data that we were going to need to get from them. Our goal from that initial vendor summit was, one, to discuss collecting fuel data from our vendors, and two, reporting program outputs. Prior to that first summit, Wyoming had a vendor agreement in place, but it was limited pretty much to the payment process, season dates, more general information, even though it included terms and conditions and expectations for our fuel vendors, and also some responsibilities from the agency side. We felt that we needed to take that existing fuel vendor and beef it up a little bit, if you will. In a collaborative effort, we actually drafted the first vendor agreement that we have in its current form today. And we did that with some valuable input from our vendors. Part of the outcome from that first vendor summit, the Fuel Supplier Rights, Responsibilities, and Agreement, was developed in more detail. That is the current title of Wyoming's vendor agreement, and I'm just going to refer to it for these purposes as the vendor agreement. And like you can see, we added a lot more detail to our vendor agreement in that process. I'd like to highlight some of those specific sections. We still included the program specific dates and that kind of information. Payment, both receiving and requesting payment. We had that kind of information in there as well. We beefed up our information about returning funds to the grantee because we felt that we were a little weak in that area in our previous vendor agreement. So we added some terms and conditions and more specific detail there. We added a section on the LIHEAP application that we use in Wyoming. And the reason that we did this is we feel that providing our fuel vendors with application and programmatic updates as part of our program outreach is very beneficial, because those fuel vendors informally serve as a grassroots program advertisement and communication network. And so these types of updates allow them to be equipped with up-to-date programmatic information. And then we also added some additional language for a section that we title Assistance for Special Situations. In Wyoming, we changed our language from crisis to special situations. And we did this because it allows us to better manage the crisis component both in cooperation with the vendor partners and with our clients. We beefed up the section on Privacy Act, and that's just like it sounds. That's the protection of confidential information. And then we really added some specifics under a section titled Certifications and Agreements. And developing this section was really where the input of our fuel vendors was crucial. Because it was a collaborative effort, we had some immediate buy-in and support from the fuel vendors, and they really became part of the solution in Wyoming. I want to just mention quickly also that there's a management component to vendor agreements as well. We've already talked, I think Iris brought this up, how often should you revisit or update your vendor agreements? Wyoming updates the vendor agreement yearly, and we do that just prior to the beginning of the new LIHEAP season in Wyoming. So usually late summer, we're in the process of doing that. We made a very recent revision to add tribal LIHEAP recipients language to the certifications page, and we wanted really just to highlight the fact that our two tribal LIHEAP programs, the Northern Arapaho and the Eastern Shoshone, are also serving eligible recipients in their respective service territories, and that many of the assurances and certifications that apply to the state grantee also apply to our tribal grantees. And so then you get all these agreements in, then what do you do with them? In Wyoming, we require our fuel vendors to reactivate by submitting a new vendor agreement each year. And when we receive those completed vendor agreements, they're reviewed both by programmatic and fiscal staff. We compare them to the prior year's vendor agreement. Any information we've received from perhaps a fuel vendor's corporate office indicating changes, we make sure that that's all captured in that new vendor agreement that we receive. And then throughout the season, we've had various reports that our LIHEAP computer system can generate to assist with the tracking and monitoring of our active fuel vendors. For example, we have a report that generates a list of all households that have not received a payment in X amount of days, and we can enter whatever specific number of days we want to look back at. That's been incredibly helpful. Our intake processors also have access to the systems of several of our larger fuel vendors, so that when we can actually log in and look at a client's fuel account billing and payment history. That's really helpful. We send out a new client list to our fuel vendors every Monday that includes their respective customers that were approved for LIHEAP during the prior week, and it also includes the benefit amount they were approved for. And then in any subsequent weeks, if there's changes, we let that fuel vendor know those kinds of updates. For example, how much benefits remaining, those kinds of things. Oh, the client moved or something of that nature. So those are just, a few examples of how We have different methods of managing and tracking our vendor agreements and the vendor performance. Our vendor agreements are imaged into our system as well as kept in hard copy files in our fiscal division. And just, quickly, I mentioned earlier, we wanted to assist in the process of building upon the tribal vendor relationships. And then we've been able to use our vendor summit in a way that we feel has maybe given the tribal grantees another opportunity to build relationships with the vendors. When we first initiated what we refer to as our vendor summit, the ultimate goal of that summit was, number one, establish vendor relations or build upon vendor relations. And then we also were able to initiate tribal vendor relations and assist in establishing tribal capacity. Another objective of the summit was to engage and educate our vendors in an ongoing way and to solicit feedback from those vendors. We've made some positive policy changes based on this feedback that we've received from our vendors at the vendor meetings. That initial vendor summit was so popular that we now do it on an annual basis. And that was at the request of the fuel vendors. The outcome has been that the state agency and the tribal grantees tend to have positive relationships with most of our mutual vendors. It's also kept lines of communication open. We share our performance measure outcomes with our vendors so they can see the positive impacts that the data demonstrates. They can see why we make some of the program decisions we make based on the data. All of this combined has really strengthened our relationships with our vendors. They're I'm going to jump into what our amended vendor agreement now looks like and some of the changes that we've made there. The notification of the LIHEAP benefit, that's spelled out very clearly that we expect our fuel providers to provide that kind of information, assurance of the household energy costs, and that the benefits are being applied to those household energy costs as you would expect, and then some LIHEAP recipient protections as well. And right here is an excerpt from the certifications page of our current Wyoming vendor agreement. And this is where we inserted that tribal language that I referred to earlier. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but as you can see in that first sentence, supplier certifies that the state or tribal LIHEAP recipients, we refer to it as LIHEAP in Wyoming, will be notified of the amount of financial assistance applied towards their total household energy costs, assures that energy charges occur in the normal billing process and in the appropriate billing cycle, and that no state or tribal LIHEAP recipient will be treated adversely nor discriminated against with regard to the cost of goods supplied or the type of service provided due to receiving state or tribal LIHEAP assistance, and so on. And really, we felt that in doing that, we had an opportunity to highlight that some of these assurances and certifications apply to all recipients, whether they're being served by the state grantee or the tribal grantee. And we thought that may help as our tribal grantee partners are working to establish and implement their own vendor agreements, and as they're making revisions. To me, the vendor agreement is really a living document, and that's why we revisit it every year and make revisions and amendments as needed. And then lastly, I would just like to add, we have found that just a little thanks goes a long way in building relationships. Doesn't matter if it's relationships with your vendors or your tribal partners, a little thanks goes a long way. So be sure to thank your vendors and your partners. And with that, I'm going to turn it back.
Okay, thank you, Brenda. Our next speaker is Ms. Ricky Trosper. Ricky is the LIHEAP and CSBG Director for the Northern Arapaho Nation. Ricky?
Thank you, Vicki. This is Ricky Trosper with the Northern Arapaho Tribe. And first of all, we'll be speaking about established relationships. So historically, tribal governments have struggled with home energy and fuel vendor relations. Through outreach from the state office, Northern Arapaho Nation has been fortunate enough to establish a relationship with Brenda Ilg. Tribal government to state government relations has allowed us to identify needs and gaps that developing partnerships may resolve. And then tribal capacity. Establishing tribal capacity allows the Northern Arapaho Nation the opportunity to exercise its tribal sovereignty. We have experienced challenges in fully developing vendor relations due to several reasons, including limited field needs compared to larger service agencies and possible cultural barriers. Participating in the Vendor Summit allowed the Northern Arapaho Nation to highlight areas of need as it relates to providing benefits to LIHEAP recipients. We have been able to open the lines of communications with vendors and are currently working to develop measures that work for the Northern Arapaho and the vendors. And our relationship with Brenda Ilg and the state of Wyoming has led to the enhancement of the Northern Arapaho Nation vendor agreement, allowing us to develop measures to protect our LIHEAP program and to ensure equal benefits are provided to tribal applicants. Without the enhancement relationship with Wyoming's home energy vendors, we would not be able to engage and educate vendors as a sovereign nation. And I'd like to add, we look forward to continuing the development of relationships and figuring out ways to mutually benefit between agency and vendor relations. It has become apparent that agreements are a valuable tool that allows for negotiation to result in benefits. Being part of the annual Vendor Summit will allow us to continue open lines of communication and provide opportunities to revisit our agreements annually for potential modifications and updates.
Okay, thank you, Ricky. So today, everyone, I know that there's been a lot of information shared, and we just want to wrap up with a little bit of a summary for you to keep in mind. As we wrap the call up. The first was the discussion that we had on the LIHEAP assurances, numbers 7 and 10, and the fiscal controls, benefit disbursement, and vendor requirements that are included in those assurances. We also talked about initiating the vendor agreement process, which includes establishing lines of communication. We also learned about Wyoming's fuel suppliers' rights, responsibilities, and agreement, which was developed with vendor input and provided details that include program dates, use of program funds, and applicant confidentiality. Next, we talked about how Wyoming's Vendor Summit addressed the challenge of developing vendor relations and provided opportunities to enhance tribal and vendor relations through education and capacity building. Next, the need for modifying and updating vendor agreements annually or as needed was discussed. And then finally, how establishing tribal capacity allows tribal grantees to exercise their sovereignty through vendor and agency relations to ensure the needs of their communities are met. So with that, we can get into some of the questions. If you do have questions, we ask that you, before asking it, we ask that you identify yourself and the name of your program, and then also to whom you're directing your question. We have one in the chat box. Does South Dakota have a vendor summit? And that's from Susan Schrader out at South Dakota. Susan, South Dakota does not have a vendor summit that I'm aware of. When Brenda was speaking about that vendor summit that they do, and Brenda, chime in here, but that is something that they do in Wyoming that's specific to Wyoming. It's something, I guess it's Brenda's brainchild, or it's something that was developed out in Wyoming as a way to get in contact with the vendors and develop relationships there. I'm not aware that they do anything like that in South Dakota, but it's always nice to make the suggestion as a possibility. And besides that, there's always the opportunity to reach out directly to the state. And then I am happy, as your regional liaison, to work with you and try to facilitate a little something in terms of working with the state. Mm-hmm.
I think it's really important because of the size of our tribe and then the interstate vendors. You know, the vendors, some are out of state, and so I think that a summit would probably be more appropriate to be specifically Oglala Sioux tribe instead of with the state of South Dakota, you know?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. But I will, you know, Vicki, I will follow up on that.
Oh, definitely.
On that.
Looking forward to it.
You have a good day.
This is Brenda, and I would just add quickly that, yes, that was something that we dreamed up when we were trying to prepare for the new LIHEAP performance measures in Wyoming. And we thought, you know what, we really cannot do this without our vendors being on board.
Right.
And so for that initial summit, we sent invites to all of our active fuel vendors and said, hey, we need your help, basically. And then from that, it grew into this annual event, and we subsequently began inviting our tribal grantees to the summit that we hold. That does not at all mean that our tribal grantees could not also hold their own summit in Wyoming. You know, that would also be something that states could look at.
Yeah. I think that the Oglala Sioux is unique because we're 100-mile by 100-mile land base. So we have, and then what we're looking, and Brenda, hello, I think I met you in Denver. Hi, how are you? But
I'm good. Yes, we did meet.
Yeah, we sat at the adjoining tables, but my thing is we're just really paying a lot of reconnection fees and deposits for people that are disconnected, and I feel like that's not a very, I really think that's something that a vendor agreement could address. Am I correct in that line of thinking?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. I feel like that's money that should be directed towards energy instead of fees, you know? So for those that are income eligible, I'd really like, so we do have a meeting with one of our vendors set up for October 8th. So that's something that we'll look at doing is, you know, I think I'd like to start developing my first vendor agreement at that time, you know? But thank you for all your help, Brenda.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, ladies, for the discussion. Before we move on to the next question, I'm going to ask that if you are not speaking, if you please would ensure that your phones are muted. All of the lines have been unmuted for the period of questions and answers. So if you were muted by the system before but didn't do it yourself, then we're going to be able to hear you if you don't do it yourself. So go ahead and hit that mute button if you're not speaking. The next question is going to be directed to Ms. Ricky Trasper. Ricky, can you describe some of the challenges that you are facing with the vendors in Wyoming?
Yeah, I had talked with Brenda about we have a propane supplier here, and they're kind of a tough one to get across. So I had asked Brenda, we met about a week or two ago, and asked her when we go and you know, approach the vendor with the vendor agreement if she would be able to, you know, come with me to do so. So I'm hoping to that'll happen very soon. So we just have new tribal attorneys, so they have our vendor agreement right now, reviewing it to make sure everything is in there that needs to be. So, but other than that, everyone else is pretty cooperative. All the other vendors.
Thank you. We might have a follow-up question for you coming, but in the meantime, are there any questions on the line? So you can feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. Ricky, Susan Schrader at Olala has asked that you contact her after this webinar so that you all can discuss vendor agreement development.
Okay.
I'll send you her contact information once we do.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was going to ask for.
Okay. You're welcome.
Hey, this is Susan Schrader again, and so Ricky, have you been able to deal with issues that I mentioned earlier, like high reconnection fees and security deposits in those agreements for tribal members?
Actually, the propane company I'm talking about, that's issues we run into with them.
Uh-huh.
And like where we live, it's, you know, so rural, where we run into if the person's not on their delivery route, then they want to charge extra, and then, you know, if they run out of propane, of course, you know, they have to, there's a fee for that. So, but the other ones are pretty, they're good to, you know, pretty good to work with.
So you have had some luck with like negotiating the amount of those fees, or are they pretty much set by the company and your agreement just documents that?
Yeah, they're pretty much set, and actually I and Brenda, we're gonna look to see who the main company is and contact them.
Uh-huh.
And see if we can get that worked out.
Yeah.
Because like he stated, that, you know, I feel too that the money should go towards their heating.
Yeah.
Yeah, because otherwise that takes a chunk out of it.
All right, I look forward to visiting with you, Ricky. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Everyone, this is Vicki again. I just have a general question for everyone that's on the line. Besides Ricky, who on the line has a current vendor agreement in place with their vendors? I'm just curious to hear from some of the webinar participants if any of you have them.
This is Lisa Rivera with Small Tribes, and we do have vendor agreements with everyone.
Oh, with all of your vendors?
Yes,
Okay.
we do.
Okay. Do you tend to update them or renegotiate them annually?
No, not usually. We work with the same utility companies, usually by county, and then there's the all-encompassing kind of state utility company. And we kind of structure them so that they are until otherwise changed. And this has been ongoing for how many years, Ann? How many years? Probably 15 years.
Oh, wow.
At least.
Okay.
Once in a while, we will update, but it maybe has been once.
Okay. Do you find that having those vendor agreements in place makes you feel more comfortable working with the vendors, or maybe provides an open line of communication because you have some kind of rapport with them?
We definitely have very good rapport with all of our vendors, and which is probably why we have not found it necessary to update agreements much. And we also have, aside from whatever instructed policy changes that have come across over the years to remain compliant with the assurances, the vendors are here in Western Washington, and the county utilities are very easy to work with. And I'm sorry to hear all the Wyoming's troubles with the disconnect, the reconnect fees, because that's something that we do try to get waived, but we do pay those on occasion for our clients. They get assessed and not reversed. So.
Okay. Okay. Do your vendor agreements speak to reconnection fees or disconnect fees, or does it mention those at all?
I believe so. Just one moment.
Okay.
I am not sure that we specifically address that in the vendor agreements, but we do pay them on occasion. We usually will circumvent it occurring just kind of with the nature of our native clients, that we can kind of get that circumvented with telephone calls directly. And we do not specifically address reconnect fees in our vendor agreements, as I'm just looking at it.
Okay. Great. Is there anyone else on the line that have current vendor agreements in place? Okay. Well, alternatively, I think we'd like to hear from some of you all who would like to have some in place but have faced some challenges with getting them developed and contacting the vendor. So if you've had that experience, we'd love to hear from you as well.
Vicki, this is Christine Celentano with Tribal Tech.
Mm-hmm.
In my very brief experience meeting with many of the people that are online, a lot of those issues, like the woman from Western Washington just talked about, are resolved as they come up and by phone. And so having the reconnection or disconnection fees as part of your vendor agreement is something that maybe a lot of folks would like to consider, because in general what I've noticed is it's not. And so if there's anyone that has those disconnect fees or reconnect fees addressed in their current vendor agreement, maybe they could share. And that would include the Lumbee tribe if you should have that in yours. It would be useful to hear about that.
Good afternoon. This is Alan Barnes with the Delaware Tribe of Indians LIHEAP program. First off, I would say that we do have multi-year vendor agreements with our major utility companies. But with that being said, within those agreements, typically the deposits or the reconnect fees, the way the companies work with us is they do not require us to include that in the past due balance or the amount that we're going to pay, but they'll charge that back on the customer's first month billing, and then may even allow them to make that up in 2 or 3 installments of those monthly bills. So that's how we do it with our major vendors.
I think that's a nice way to do it, to kind of break it up for folks to pay. And that stipulation that you have there is actually in the agreement?
I'm going to go back and unmute here.
Okay.
As far as the actual stipulation in the agreement, I would just have to check. That just simply has been a long-standing situation that we've had, again, with our major utility companies, public service, ONG, so on and so forth. So I can't tell you whether that's actually written in the agreement or not.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. We also had a comment from Patrick, who is the director down at the Lumbee Tribe. He's saying that Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina has a vendor agreement that is amended annually. Our agreements are renewed annually with each vendor before any LIHEAP payment is dispersed, is what they do down at Lumbee. Okay, thank you for that, Patrick.
But the vendor agreement's available if any grantee wishes to get it for review.
Is that on the clearinghouse?
It was, but I can submit an updated one. We actually just submitted it for the year beginning for October 1.
Great.
And getting back to deposits, one thing that we changed in the past couple of years is probably like many tribal nations, our tribal members move a lot, and we were seeing that the deposits that were being paid, let's just say if a household moved somewhere and for some reason they moved in 30 minutes, the utility company was paying that deposit back to the household, and some deposits can increase up to $600 depending on the household's payment history. So one thing that we entered into our vendor agreement is that each utility tracks the payments that are made, and if a deposit is made and when the household severs the account, that deposit, if there's a balance remaining, is paid back to the tribe for reallocation of funds versus sending a check to the homeowner.
Great.
And that has worked out well.
So you have a little bit of a vendor refund process worked into the agreement, okay? That's excellent. I think that would be good for folks to see if you wouldn't mind getting that uploaded to the Clearinghouse, your updated one.
Yes,
I think that would be nice for folks to see. Let me ask you this too, Patrick. The vendor agreements have probably been in place, and the process for renewing them annually has probably been in place for a while. Do you know if in the beginning of all of this there were any challenges with working with the vendors, or any that really weren't trying to participate or sign an agreement?
When I came on board with LIHEAP in 2009, there was already a vendor agreement established. While it was very minimal, it addressed, like Brenda said earlier, basically payment receipts and things like that. So since then, we've kind of expanded into requiring the vendors to sign the agreement before we disperse any LIHEAP funds. So that kind of, we're a larger grantee, so the grantees were really wanting to sign these agreements to ensure that they get their funds, so to speak.
Right.
We really didn't have any problems on that aspect. One of the things that we ran into when it comes into security of funds is that when an applicant would come into the office when they were on disconnect, we would go ahead and process the application, and if they were eligible, we would go ahead and make that pledge for payment to secure utilities with the vendor, and they were getting the process. So we realized that in the summer times when the weather really didn't warrant heating or cooling and households would be ineligible, they had started calling the utility companies themselves, acting as if they were an agent of the tribe, saying, the tribe is going to make a payment of some sort. And then the utility was calling us asking for payment. We're like, we didn't make that. The homeowner had done that out of fraud. So part of our vendor agreement now is that each utility requires a password from each tribal staff that makes that pledge. And we don't do it in front of the client anymore. So if someone that's not a tribal agent called a utility company to make a pledge on an account, they're asking for the password for that person, which stops the fraud. That's one thing, the biggest issues that we added recently.
That's very interesting, and I think that what you just said speaks to what was mentioned earlier, in that these vendor agreements really need to be very specific to the grantees, because that turns out to have been an issue at Lumbee, whereas it might not be an issue anywhere else. So having the flexibility and then also the wherewithal to include that in your vendor agreement, I think is really important, so that it speaks directly to that situation.
And it was a security measure for the vendor, not necessarily a tribe, because we were not out of anything. But, they were out of store deliveries. They were out of, utilities for a month. So, that was one way of getting that added into the agreement, because that was a security measure on their part.
Right. Okay, yeah, I think that's really great. Are there any other questions from folks on the line? Vendor agreements or anything you'd like to share with the group? Okay, well, I think we've actually come to the end of our time together. We want to leave you, as we end this webinar, I want to leave you with a few resources here for additional information on vendor agreements. And as was mentioned in the beginning of the call, this presentation is available as a download. That should be in your screen. Some looks like towards the bottom in the center area, looks like you can click on and download the presentation for yourself. If you have any questions that went unanswered, or you'd like to chat more about vendor agreements, then you are always free to reach out to your regional liaison. We're always happy to help and to answer any questions that you might have. And as I mentioned to Susan, we can also help facilitate any discussions that you might want to have with your state partners. So with that, we really appreciate everyone taking the time to join us today. We hope you learned something new, and we will go ahead and wrap up. Thanks, everyone, for joining.